Hello, and thank you for joining the LAMP and the Institute for Human Ecology for this online event. I'm Nick Rowan, managing editor of the LAMP, and I'm joined by our editor, Matthew Walther, and Stephen White, executive director of the Catholic Project. Hello. Tonight, we're discussing the Catholic vote, a voting bloc which in every election cycle is subject to a new round of scrutiny, mainly over the question of whether it exists in any meaningful way at all. I think at this point it's a truism to say that the Catholic vote is a myth, and it is frequently pointed out that in almost every single recent presidential election, except notably 2016, the majority of Catholics have voted for the winning candidate. But Stephen, in a recent essay for National Review, you argued that, just with the broader changes in the country, the voting habits of American Catholics could be changing in significant ways. Could you summarize your argument in brief for us?
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick, and it's good to be here. Thanks to IG and the LAMP. Matthew, it's good to be with you. Um, as you said, that the history of the Catholic vote suggests that it's more of a sort of just a subset of how Americans normally vote, right? That we're between 20 and 25% of the electorate at any given national election identifies as Catholic, and we vote more or less the same way all other Americans vote. When the Democrat wins the popular vote, Catholics tend to favor that person by about the same margin. And same when a Republican wins the popular vote, Catholics tend to favor that candidate by the same margin or similar margins. That started to change, as you mentioned, in 2016, and it was really different this year. But Catholics did support the winning candidate by really significant margins. They broke for Donald Trump. Depending on your exit vote, it was somewhere between so low teens up to as much as 20% swing over their support for Trump in 2016. So you saw this big shift among Catholics that outpaced the shift of the country at large. And so the question then is this the Catholic vote just sort of shifting towards the winner of the popular vote, as it always does, but by a little bit more? And that's just sort of an outlier? Or is there something to this shift that suggests a longer term shift, that the Catholic vote is coming back to be a regular predictor of who's going to win because it acts as a voting bloc, right? So in 1960, for example, something like 80% of Catholics voted for John F. Kennedy, and he won very narrowly. The Catholics not only voted heavily for one candidate, but they voted decisively for the candidate that won. That hasn't really happened since the late 1960s. And so the question then is this coming back? Have we reached a point where the Catholic vote is going to be decisive again, is going to be playing that swing role that it once played, but hasn't played in a long time? And how much of that, if that is the case, then how much of that has to do with Donald Trump in particular? How much of that has to do with the realignment we've been hearing so much about? How much of that has to do with ordinary kitchen table issues like the economy or issues like immigration that sort of tend to affect all Americans equally? So it's worth paying attention to the swing of the Catholic vote this election, because it was so significant, because it really shifted so much. But whether that will be sustainable or have sort of is suggestive of a long-term sort of fundamental shift in American politics, we don't know yet. But it's interesting at least to talk about some of the ways that might be coming down the pike.
So I feel like, before talking about the future, it almost might be worthwhile to go back and talk about why this phrase, why, however disputed or at times even nebulous, the idea of a distinct block of Catholics as voters exists. Because there was a time, notably in 1960, but even before then, when Catholics are part of the New Deal coalition, when it seems like not only is there an identifiably and obviously a Catholic vote, but it also seems like the Catholic vote, in pretty striking and obvious ways, aligns with the views of the candidate in question. So in the interwar period, obviously, when we're reading papal encyclicals about, economic solidarity text that FDR is quoting on the campaign trail, and he's meeting with cardinals and stuff, and he's following these trends and to some extent trying to exploit them. But I think um, in another more wholesome sense, you could say he's influenced broadly by this tendency away from laissez-faire, which also manifests itself on the continent in other ways. I think you can look at that and you can say the rise of trade unions, the New Deal. If you look sociologically at what do we mean when we even talk about American Catholics at that point, you're talking largely about an immigrant descended working class population. And so it makes sense. It's a cohesive, identifiable group of voters. And it's interesting to think of 1960 there as a kind of inflection point. In one sense, it's the first you have with Kennedy, you have the first, American Catholic president. And you have Catholics turning out to vote for him, 8-2 or whatever. But not long after that, I feel like you have all these other trends. You start to see the beginning of what will be this precipitous decline in union membership. You have white flight, where these kind of ethnic enclaves in major cities on the East Coast and in the Midwest, these people are moving to the suburbs. And this has all kinds of consequences. In some cases, it involves the creation of totally new dioceses in states like Michigan, where the Archdiocese of Detroit was half the state. And then you create, several new ones, and the erection of new parishes. And so as Catholics spread out into the suburbs, and as they climb the class ladder, or some of them do, my sense is that it becomes harder to talk about a discrete, identifiable Catholic vote, even if in the aggregate you can talk about Catholics voting a certain way. When I look at the 2024 election, I see young Hispanic men voting for Trump for one set of reasons. And I see older, 60, 70-year-old suburban, retired white women voting for Trump for a different set of reasons. But I guess it's just harder for me to imagine that this is that this has much to do with the church or with them as Catholics. And that was something that I took away from your piece, just a sense that, you end up saying something like, why did Catholics vote for Donald Trump? Well, in part because Kamala Harris was a really unappealing, kind of ersatz incumbent. And, ultimately Catholics voted for Trump for the same reasons that everybody else voted for him.
Yeah, obviously I agree with that. That was part of what I wrote. I think it's, this history, which is endlessly fascinating to me, about how the blue collar immigrant Catholic Democrat of 1950 or 1960 became sort of middle class, probably white collar Republican during the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, and how that seems to be shifting again, or is that shifting again? Like so many things that involve Catholic history and Catholic history in the United States, something happened between 1960 and say 1972 when Catholics started this pattern of behavior where they just vote for the person who wins the popular vote. But I'm not talking about just the Second Vatican Council and all the things that did to the American Catholicism in general. the 1968 election, you had essentially a split Democratic Party. By 1973, with the arrival of Roe v. Wade, you have this beginning of the sifting out of the two parties. You know, my friend and colleague George Weigel says, if you had guessed in 1965 that abortion was going to be illegal, which party do you think would have become the pro-life party? Everybody would have said the Democrats.
That's right.
Right. But it happened the opposite. That didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen in 1973. There are lots of names of Democratic politicians we'd recognize now, some of who are sort of passing from this stage of history, but there was a whole generation of pro-choice Democrats who began their careers pro-life, including Al Gore and things like that. So you had Ramesh Ponnuru,
Ted Kennedy.
Joe
right,
Biden.
right, and so and Joe Biden, right? These guys started pro-life, or at least very skeptical about Roe, and that as they became more, and the party became more uniformly pro-choice. A lot of people point to 1992, where Bob Casey Sr. was sort of blackballed from the convention, or sort of the decisive moment. And the Democratic Party eventually became uniformly pro-choice. The Republicans sort of became, if not principally, then for practical purposes, pro-life-ish, at least at the national level. The sorting out of the parties into pro-life and pro-choice parties, you can make the case, and Kristen Day, who runs Democrats for Life, has made this case in the past, that the loss of huge Democratic majorities in the House of Representatives, the underperformance of Democrats in national elections, a lot of that has to do with Democrats losing pro-life voters who'd otherwise be Democrats, but because of that issue. So that's a 50-year trend. Another trend that's been happening, that's been happening for a while, is the sorting out of the two parties as sort of the party of religion and the party of irreligion. This is not something I celebrate, but it's something that this is one way to describe the sorting out of Americans according to party. And it's interesting. We haven't focused on it as much as Donald Trump has done a lot to court religious voters, Catholic, evangelical, or otherwise, but I don't think anybody thinks he's an especially religious candidate. There was a very interesting, I think this was from a Fox exit poll. But they asked, how often do you attend religious services, if at all? And the 5 options you were given were never, a couple times a year, about once a month, a couple times a month, or weekly or more, right? So once a month is sort of the middle ground there. Less than once a month, but not never is another option. Never is the worst option. The only group that voted for Kamala Harris was the never. Donald Trump won every other category. And it's been the case for decades that people who attend religious services weekly or more often overwhelmingly vote for Republicans, whether it's Donald Trump or not. So to go back to what you were saying, it has been the case for a long time that you can't tell much about any given American by the fact that they say that they're Catholic. It doesn't tell you much about their politics. It doesn't tell you much about their socioeconomic status. It doesn't even, frankly, tell you much about what they believe religiously. That may be changing. There was an article, maybe changing. I'm not sure it is. There was an article published at National Catholic Reporter on the Catholic vote and some of the issues we're talking about. It ended with a quote from E.J. Dionne, who's not someone I agree with on a lot of things, but he's been paying attention to these questions for a very long time. And he said the Catholic vote is becoming more conservative, which I think is true. And he says, and this is, I'm just reading what he says, I really do think some of it is because a lot of cradle Catholics who are progressives no longer identify as Catholic. You've got 2 Catholic worlds now that are pulling apart. Now, if that's true, what you might see is that the Catholic vote will become more identifiably Catholic by attrition, or more identifiable with a certain brand of Catholicism by attrition. Now, this is not something I'm advocating for. It's something I even think would be desirable. But if the people who are former Catholics or who have drifted away from the church or who rarely or never go to Mass become increasingly affiliated with the Democratic Party, people who go to church are more affiliated with the Republican Party, as as those long-standing cultural affiliations and identifications as Catholic because my last name starts O' or whatever, because grandma went to church and so I'm a Catholic, as that tends to fall away, and I think there's evidence that it is. What you might see is a result where people who identify as Catholic, who actually think of themselves as Catholic, are just more likely to be people who go to church more, which means they're more likely to be people who vote Republican. And so you might see the comeback of a Catholic vote, as I said, almost by attrition. So you've gone through this phase of half a century or more where you can't really tell much about what someone thinks politically by the fact that they're Catholic. We may be approaching the end of that. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. I don't think that this last election showed that had happened. But there's reason to see the sorting of it, to talk about realignment is a term that's been much in the air. One of those realignments really may be following on this trend we've seen evidence of going back several elections, several decades even, of an alignment to sort of the progressive secular party or irreligious party, at least non-practicing party, and an increasingly religious party on the other side. I'm not sure what that means for America. I'm not sure that's a healthy trend, but there's certainly evidence suggesting that we're heading in that direction, or at least drifting in that direction.
So, to be clear, so on this understanding, the Catholic vote, on the one hand, would become more cohesive, but small,
Yeah.
because of the attrition, right? It would be less of a force.
Yeah, and you already see that happening. It's not. It might be. So if you look at the percentage of Catholic, of the percentage of voters who identify as Catholic in exit polls, which are always a little bit wonky, but they're fairly big sample sizes. So it ranges between 25 and 20%. This year was about 20%, a little over. So it's down a couple ticks from before. But if people who identify as Catholic for cultural or family reasons, who never go to church, don't practice in any meaningful sense, as they, let's say, age out of the electorate, are they being replaced by cultural Catholics who are going to vote the same way they do? Probably not. They might be replaced by other voters who vote the same way they do, but not because, but they're less likely to identify as Catholic or whatever. So what you'll see is that the attrition of people who are Catholic and vote is likely to be more from Catholic and vote Democrat than from I say I'm Catholic because I practice my faith, and I'm statistically those people are much more likely to vote for a Republican for president, and that's been that way for a while.
So it's a thing that's sort of more or less in line with the old Benedict quote, about the smaller something church, just
smaller, purer church, which again, Benedict was not being prescriptive there. He was not suggesting this was a good idea. He was describing what he saw, what he thought was
right.
Right. If you've got, to use a biblical metaphor, I hope this doesn't sound too harsh. If you've got a bush that needs pruning, right? People have fallen away. People have become lukewarm. To mix metaphors, there'll be lukewarm parts of the bush that need to be pruned. So if you have pruning of the vine, at some point you lose membership. Clearly, the church has been losing membership among certain kinds of people. If that's disproportionately people who don't practice, and those people statistically are more likely to vote Democrat, chances are they're more likely to be losing Democratic voters. Especially, it's interesting to consider, Matthew, you mentioned already that sort of the Trump's success with Hispanic voters, and especially Hispanic or Latino men this election. He won Latino men outright this election nationally, which is a big deal. He is interesting. He performed worse this year among white voters than he did in 2016 or 2020, of course, but he performed worse against white voters generally than he did in 2016. But he made up for that by performing better among minorities. I think 4 years ago, he lost the Hispanic vote by something like 33 points. Okay, which was actually a pretty good showing for a Republican. To lose by only 33 points was a pretty good showing. He lost the Hispanic vote in 2024 by 5 or 6 points. That's a huge swing, and a lot of those voters are Catholic. Now, did Hispanics vote for Trump because they're Catholic? Did they vote for him because of kitchen table issues? Did they vote for him because of immigration? They live along the border, and they may be immigrants themselves or descended from immigrants, but they don't like the chaos that they see there. I don't know the answer to those questions, but this is, that's a huge shift among a group of voters, Hispanic voters, who Democrats have sort of taken for granted. it for a long time as sort of that's a given. We've got those votes locked up, and Trump showed that that's not the case at all. Like I said, he almost split the vote from Hispanic voters and one Hispanic man outright. That's a massive red flag if you're a Democrat, that your coalition is being picked off piecemeal. So,
Well, Kamala, when at some whatever point that was in August or September, started talking about building the wall. Maybe she wanted to keep the Trump voters out. But
if the first person who ever made the case to me that they were seriously hoping that Donald Trump would be elected president, this is in 2015, the first person who said, I really like this Donald Trump guy to be president, was the lady who was cutting my hair, an immigrant lady with a thick Eastern European accent. And I was a little surprised that she said that. And I said, why? I live in a very blue part of Virginia. And here was this lady who grown up in Eastern Europe, who was saying she really liked Donald Trump, hoped he'd become president. I said, why is that? And she said, because of his stance on immigration. She said, I'm an immigrant. My children are immigrants. We did it the right way. We stood in line. We got our visas or whatever. We stood through the application, and she had no time for people who didn't do that. So, like I said, I was a bit surprised. But here you had someone who is an immigrant who was supporting Donald Trump very early on, precisely because of his stance on immigration, his hardline stance on immigration. So my anecdote is obviously just one, but I think there was the immigration issue doesn't play as simplistically among voters who are themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants as the sort of the generally available media narrative would suggest.
so I think one thing that's worth going kind of zooming out and talking about is a level of analysis that I think neither of us is particularly interested in, but which is, for reasons that are baffling to me, still kind of pervasive in our circles, which is one that assumes, I would say one that assumes a sense of sort of normative orthopraxy, which I think is very, very rare. And this is the kind of analysis that says Donald Trump won among Catholics. Well, this must be because Trump is the candidate of religious freedom, and because Kamala said bad things about the Knights of Columbus. And these voters who are so keyed in to the circulars from their bishops, these 37-page PDFs that I'm sure every single person in the pews reads, that break down all these issues and, have parenthetical citations to various magisterial pronouncements, or even links to further exhilarating PDFs from the USCCB. The idea that there's a kind of voter out there who's really keyed in and thinks about this stuff in an abstract, intellectual, cohesive manner, as opposed to just thinking about which candidate to support for the same broad, sweeping range of reasons that, any other voter would. I don't know. Should we just make short work of this? But
Yeah.
it's interesting. Why are people interested in thinking about the issue that way still? Because it seems so obviously absurd. Like, the number of people who I think about electoral politics that way.
Mm.
It would surprise me if they could swing an election, for dog catcher.
Well, the part of the reasoning behind that, the view, not the view, but the view of politics that comes out of people who hold those views, is that you don't have to move the electorate 20 or 30%. You just need to move it 1 or 2%. And if you get even a portion of Catholics, Catholics are 20 to 25% of the American electorate. If you move Catholics 1 or 2%, that's That's a big difference. If you do that 1 or 2% in swing states, that's a big difference. Electorally, that's a big difference. So, well, I don't think that there are voters who think about electoral politics in terms of primarily in terms of religious freedom or in terms of say single issue pro-life voters. There are voters who vote that way, and there are a lot of them. They tend not to be swing voters, though.
Right.
So they tend not to be swing voters. So, um, um, with someone like Donald Trump, sort of really making the pitch hard to those voters might make more of them likely to vote for someone they don't like. Um, I think a lot of those kinds of voters, the voters we're talking about, probably weren't very likely to vote for a Democrat, no matter who it was. So you can boost turnout for someone like Donald Trump by really focusing on those voters. But I think there's also a degree to which, look, I don't think, and this is my guess, I could make a case that the data suggests that my argument is at least plausible. But this is just my take. There aren't a lot of voters who voted explicitly on the trans issue. I don't think there are a lot of voters who voted explicitly on say school choice. There weren't a lot of voters who voted explicitly on a lot of these, what I think are important issues, but are just, in terms of how the American electorate generally votes, are niche issues, right? I didn't even think, I think probably on abortion, even, for example, I think that was probably a net positive for Kamala Harris. If you look at who voted in this election and said abortion was my most important issue, those voters overwhelmingly voted for Kamala because they were worried about abortion rights being taken away or whatever. I think in aggregate, though, you take all those, call them culture war issues, whatever, this election did have a general sense that's very difficult to quantify. There was a generalized sense that the crazy's gotten a little bit excessive. And people might not identify that with a particular issue or with religious liberty or with a particular court case or whatever. I think there was a, like I said, a very difficult to quantify, just simply reactionary element to this. There was a lot of voters who said, I've just sort of had it with this nonsense. Now, let's posit that I'm right, that was a big part of Trump's victory. It was certainly a big part of his pitch to the American voter. I mean, the ad everyone talks about is the ad he wrote where, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, right? And I think that was obviously about the trans issue, but it was about a lot more than that, right? Kamala is about these sort of progressive pieties that don't make any sense and that don't resonate with most people. And Donald Trump's not for that nonsense. He's for you. He's for common sense. He's tangible. Anyway, that ad seemed to have resonated really well with a lot of people. That generalized sense is made up a lot of these, and plays off of and draws energy from a lot of these smaller, call them niche issues. So I think it would be easy to take one of those niche issues and overemphasize its importance for the election. Even issues that aren't particularly niche, like abortion, which a lot of people have opinions on that. As far as niche issues go, that's sort of one of the big ones. But altogether, they collectively made up this climate of that I think what did have a big effect on the election. How that translates going forward is a very interesting question. So if you're Donald Trump and you were president and you lost to a candidate who ran as, I've been running for president for 40 years, you know who I am. I'm sort of an elderly white guy who, with more or less good moderate credentials, we've been through a crazy time in politics. I'm going to be normal. And Joe Biden won, didn't govern that way. Trump comes back and says, you know who I am. Enough of the nonsense. Let's go back to common sense. Okay, great. But if in 4 years from now, he's not going to be on the ballot, and whether you liked his record over the next 4 years or not, he can't run as the outsider again. Right? That was sort of when Donald Trump could run as an outsider, he won the election. When he ran as an incumbent, he lost. Whoever runs next, either sort of whoever the heir apparent to Donald Trump is, money right now would probably go on J.D. Vance, but that's another issue. Whoever runs next, if they're going to run on sort of the Trump movement, the Trump populism, they're going to have to run as an incumbent. They have to defend the record. They can't run as the outsider who's going to come and drain the swamp for the fourth time or for the third time in 4 elections. At some point, the incumbent party the party that built this new coalition, if they want to govern, if they want to make that lasting, and we're talking about Republicans here, if they want to make that lasting, they have to have some sort of positive vision of government or policy around which to rally, because they can't always be on the outside saying, the folks in Washington are screwing it up when they're the folks in Washington, right? So how this populist resentment against the way things have been going, the out of touch elites, the out of control progressivism, whatever phrases the Trump campaign wanted to use, now that they have to govern, that the viability of those same campaign promises, and to a certain degree, perhaps the glue that held his electoral coalition together, is going to have to change between now and 4 years from now. Or it seems to me it's possible you can keep it together simply on the strength of improving the economy, or simply on the strength of cracking down on immigration. But you can't, at some point the populace takes the White House, and the populace has to be, the outsider becomes the man. And then you have to, you take a very different position, and all the old slogans against the disruption now becomes something very different. How the coalition Trump seems to have built makes that transition is a very interesting question to me. Is this coalition, Catholics and otherwise, that gave him this sort of surprising but significant and sweeping victory, sweeping all all 7 of the swing states, is a very convincing victory. How does that translate to a coherent, ideological, and then sort of non-charged sense of the term, coherent sort of governing strategy going forward? I don't know, especially with Donald Trump, being in his last term now, or about to begin his last term now. That's a question I don't have an answer for. We'll see how that goes over the next 4 years, and we'll probably still be talking about it in 4, 8, or 12 years. But that's an interesting question going forward.
So just going back to the question of to what extent you have voters who are formed either by reading formal magisterial pronouncements, or by reading the little brochure that appears, every 4 years in the narthex around election time. Regardless of the extent to which people are being formed by their bishops or their pastors, there is also this interesting hard reality, which is the clergy, if we can talk about them in sociological terms, tend to be more civically engaged than the median American. I do you know the number off your head? Like, what percentage of priests vote? I would imagine.
I don't know that number.
I would imagine.
I guess
it's it's not a small percentage.
right. I would guess that it's probably above the median for.
Yeah. And when I think about that, a couple years ago, and you could probably go into more detail about this, but the Catholic Project did this fascinating survey where they asked priests to describe themselves. It's entirely self-reported. And I want to say there were in each of the 2 categories, there were basically 5 gradations where you were expected to say, theologically speaking, do you consider yourself very progressive, moderate, conservative, very conservative, or actually I think orthodox was the term that we used there. And then the same question, but politically speaking, and there I think it was actually very progressive, moderate, conservative, very conservative. Right. And one thing that I found so fascinating was that if you look at the priests who were ordained, I'm trying to think how far back it went, maybe to 1970? Was that the earliest?
It went back. It went back farther than that. But yeah, the trend that we see currently seems to have begun around the late 60s or 1970.
Yeah. So what I recall is that among the very oldest priests surveyed, you tended to see on the theological scale, um, priests were, I mean, some obviously identified as very conservative, but a lot were in the middle or kind of self-identified progressives. And then as you start to get into the 80s and especially the early 90s, you see that start to shift a little. And that seemed to track more or less with their self-reported political views until you get to priests ordained in the last 10 to 15 years, where you see what looks to me anyway like this trend where there are priests who identify as Orthodox or ultra Orthodox or what I look up for the term, you know,
Pathetic Catholic.
uh, you know, who politically are identifying as moderate or even, I mean, depending on how these people are defining these terms for themselves, progressive. And it's just very interesting for me, especially to step outside the realm of, American electoral politics to the equally fascinating world of American ecclesial politics, and especially like the liturgy wars or whatever. This You find yourself looking at this kind of amusing picture where, you know, Father Beach Church, you know, uh, is more likely to be like a real like red, white, and blue, you know, kind of uncritical Republican, and then you have this, fussy Father Youngtrad in a Beretta who has maybe
Voted for Bernie Sanders once upon a time.
yeah, voted for Bernie once when he was in seminary quietly, or at the very least, like, is trying to, you know, in some senses, when he thinks about these issues, tries to be informed by the full range of kind of magisterial reflection, on questions like the environment or, maybe in terms of economic issues, has views that might harken back more to the Catholic vote when it was a identifiable cohesive thing in the New Deal era. Um, what's interesting to me about that there too is, I mean, we haven't even talked about this yet, but the vice president elect is the first Republican, uh, you know, to be elected, um, on a ticket, and as a Catholic, and Vance, and I'm not really speaking to it so much to his actual record in the Senate. I mean, he wasn't in there for very long. But even there, as far as some of the legislation he sponsored or some of the people he was willing to work with, um, and looking back further to his time as a writer or commentator, whatever, in a broad way, you could say that he's not, he's just not a standard issue kind of Reaganite conservative. And there's a sense in which he's more of a top left quadrant
Right.
kind of thinker. And so I'm just curious if you think, in a world where, due to the factors contributing to the attrition you mentioned, where the Catholic vote is maybe this smaller thing in raw numbers, but also more concrete and identifiable. Do you see those two tendencies maybe kind of lining up?
I'm going to take the easy way and say maybe. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about, what were the constitutive parts of the old Reagan coalition? What was the old fusionism based on, right? So you're coming out of the 60s and 70s, and you get the Republican Party coalescing around basically three big ideas. One is sort of libertarian-ish economics, anti-communism, and then social conservatism, right? These are the three legs of the stool. Um, uh, and Catholics, at least two of those deeply resonated with Catholics: the anti-communism part and the social conservative part, especially as abortion and things like divorce and all the social issues became more important after the late 60s. Um, I think in very broad strokes, I think Catholics shifted toward the right in the Reagan era and into the Bush era, um, usually moving right on the strength of those two stools, the anti-communism and the social conservatism. The anti-communism thing sort of went away in the late 90s. And they picked up some of the libertarian stuff. I don't think they picked up quite as much as some people think they did, but it crept in the back door to a certain degree. I mean, you also, during that same time frame, you had, so your median Catholic went from being a blue collar guy in the upper Midwest or the Northeast to being a very different demographic and socioeconomic profile. White collar in the upper Midwest or Northeast, or immigrant Catholics on the West Coast or in the South. The fastest growing parts of the Catholic Church in the United States are the historically least Catholic parts of the country, right? So the South, the church in the South is growing rapidly. It's growing in the Southwest, not as quickly, and it's collapsing in a lot of places in the Northeast, and so you have the old bastions of the old way of being Catholic within the American system are the parts of the Catholic Church in the United States that are struggling the most right now, which is interesting. Catholics our age, not to make you two gentlemen as old as me, but if you came of age, if you're 40 years old or younger, so basically if you're a millennial or younger, you're an American Catholic, your experience of the American Catholic Church and American life and American politics is, the abuse crisis, the breaking of the abuse crisis, 9/11. This is the very tail end of John Paul II's pontificate. You have endless wars in the Middle East. You have the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the late, at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Obama administration. You have the election of the first Black president who, has the Little Sisters of the Poor in court for a long time. We get Obergefell, legalization of gay marriage. Then on the heels of that, we get the Donald Trump thing, whatever that was. In the first administration, you get COVID, you get Joe Biden. So this hasn't been a string of, for your sort of middle of the road 1980s, 1990s Reagan Republican, small c conservative Catholic. That's not a run of ringing successes. And if you're the children of those people, you're looking around saying, what's going on here? Like, this isn't a rough patch. This is my entire adult life. The church in the United States has just been taking its lumps, or in some ways worse, been irrelevant. And so I think if that's the generation we're talking about, 40 years old and younger, where it's sort of the younger cohorts of priests, but also some of the younger cohorts of Americans, you see them taking a very different approach to American society, American politics, and American religion. That manifests in lots of different ways that I'm not, I could begin to describe to that extent, but I think there has been definitely a significant generational shift among American Catholics, even among the sort of practicing Catholics. These aren't the nuns. That's a big dynamic, but there's people who sort of stopped practicing their faith or have drifted away. Even among the young practicing, there's the pieties of sort of middle American Reagan Republican sort of American Catholicism. Those pieties don't belong to the young Catholics who are voting Republican now. That's just they're doing it for very different reasons. Some of those reasons I think are good reasons. Some things I think are bad reasons. But I think for people who are looking to see how the Catholic vote is shifting or how it might shift further in the future, it's very important to pay attention to how younger Catholics, younger practicing Catholics, younger Catholics who vote, how they see the challenges facing them and how they see the history of the last 20 or 30 years. Because the generation that's been in power for the last 20 or 30 years tends not to see it, at least not to see it very clearly. So I think that's really important. I think I have lots of nuanced thoughts about J.D. Vance, but I think precisely because of what I just described, he comes in as the vice president and presumably, at least for now, as the heir apparent to Donald Trump. as one of the most interesting sort of characters to come onto the scene of American politics in quite some time. Um, I don't know how that'll play off. People who get too close to Trump tend to get chewed up and spit out. I don't know that will happen to him, or they preserve themselves by becoming more and more like Trump in ways that people shouldn't become more and more like Trump. So maybe that happens to him. Maybe he endures and takes the best of the populism that Trump sort of kicked off and the realignment that he did, and is able to run with it in a humane direction, and one that builds support among Catholics and others going forward and strengthens the coalition. I don't know, but we're going to find out one way or another. So.
So yeah, I actually, so if you want, we could open up to questions unless you have one last thing you want to say, Matthew.
No, that's what I was going to say. That seems like a perfect time if we want to take a couple of those before we.
Sure. Yeah. So I have something from someone who's listening in here that actually I think fits in pretty nicely with what you were just saying, Stephen. I'll just read it aloud. I voted for the American Solidarity Party. I had people on the left and right tell me this was a cop out, that was a luxury choice, or a privileged way to vote. They also said my vote was about unrealistic purity. What would you say to that criticism? I assume this person is Catholic.
So I didn't vote. I'm
Yeah.
a constitutional non-voter. But I would, I mean, my attitude there would be that it just depends on, in that case, almost on your underlying view of the act of voting itself. Are you voting because you think of it as a speech act and you want to express your support for a candidate who, though unlikely to attract, a majority or whatever, you know, is the closest to, your own views about the issues? Um, or do you feel like, with either of the major party candidates, there are just issues that make it impossible for you to lend your support? Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that I think this talk about like a luxury vote or whatever is silly. I also think that the number of people who, for this particular set of reasons, feel inclined to vote for third parties is so small that you know, I'm not I'm just not sure how significant the phenomenon is. Though it's weird because it's one of those, it's almost like the opposite of the Pauline Kael Nixon thing, where 99.9% of Americans have never heard of the American Solidarity Party, but in my own like social circles, like, you know, I mean, I know dozens of people
Right.
voted for who have voted for them going back to 2016.
Look, my take on this is, this is going to sound trite, is you should vote your conscience. I don't think that either party has an absolute claim on my vote one way or another. Now, no matter how awful one or the other seems to be, I'm not being asked when I go to vote. I'm not being asked to decide the future of our country. I'm being asked to cast a ballot for who I think would be best to represent me. It's not a vote for policy. It's not a vote for who. It's where I live. It's almost certainly not going to be decisive one way or another because of how I generally vote. So I go and I vote for who I think would be the best. Sometimes that's someone at the top of the ticket, or who you're filling little circles. Sometimes that's a write-in. But the idea that you're throwing away your vote, I think, is just not true. I think that gives too much power to the two-party system. And I think, if you are in a small local election where an election might be decided by one or two votes, maybe that's different than, are you voting in a deep red or deep blue state where your vote's probably not going to matter one way or another, and everyone knows months ahead of time who's going to win. So, I think it depends on where you're voting, who you're voting for, whether you are, I have friends who would make the argument, look, if you think one candidate is better than the other, you should vote for the candidate you think is better, or the candidate you think is less bad, you should just vote for that person. I get that. I don't think that that's an unreasonable argument. I just don't think it's universally binding either. So it's a prudential argument.
Yeah. So we have another question here. Is there a difference between how urban and suburban Catholics vote? Is that now a bigger difference than, say, church attending and non-church attending Catholics?
I haven't seen data breaking down urban Catholics versus rural Catholics. Urban voters voted heavily for Democrats this go round, and they voted, rural voters voted heavily for Trump this time around. I don't know where most American Catholic mass goers live. My guess is it's probably similar to where most of the rest of America lives. I think mass going Catholics voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump this election, which is not surprising. It's been the case for a long time. I've said this already. It's been the case for a long time. One of the best, most consistent and accurate predictors of how someone is going to vote is how often they attend religious services. And that's not just true for Catholics. That's true for pretty much all Christians with very few exceptions. And I think Jews and maybe even Muslims too. So I don't know the exact answer because I haven't seen those crosstabs, but my guess is that church-going Catholics in cities tend to vote red, just like church-going Catholics elsewhere. Probably not quite at the rates, but I think it still breaks the same way. Which is to say, going to mass matters more than going to mass in the city or going to mass in the country.
I think I would just say, following on what Stephen was saying earlier, talking about the future at all is so strange here precisely because we're in this bizarre Grover Cleveland situation where we have a president serving a non-consecutive term and a president who seems anyway to be able to build these coalitions out of these disparate elements. And this is something that Stephen had talked about in his essay, reflecting on the outcome of the election a few weeks ago. For me, it still comes back to this question of what does any of this look like after Trump? If the phrase cult of personality can be used in a value neutral context, I would say that, he definitely has one. And that's so much of his ability to, peel off suburban retirees at the same time that he's, doubling or tripling, his take among, Hispanic men is bound up in, a combination of factors unique to Trump. And regardless of whether, Vance, as someone would expect, is the nominee after him, or whether Trump decides to do some kind of apprentice style, thing where various people are kind of vying for his endorsement. I just think that that's a question lurking in the background of all of this.
So we have more. Sorry, Dick. Oh, no. I just have one more question, but I don't want to cut you off.
But I was just saying, we haven't, he's not even been inaugurated yet. We still got a ways to go for that. We're still in the, still got a month of the Biden administration to go.
So I think this is a good one to end on here. Should the clergy be more involved in forming the consciences of their parishioners regarding the way they vote? And if so, how?
Should they be? Yes. Do I have a clear ways that they could do that? I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks that on the one hand, I think priests speaking clearly and sensibly, and not in a partisan way, but in a clear and sensible way about issues of public policy and public life and citizenship would be a good thing. Bishops and priests. That said, as Matthew pointed out, bishops speak about this fairly frequently. If anything, 4 years ago, they talked about presidential politics and the possibility of denying communion to Biden and all this. It was a much bigger news issue last time, generally with the bishops being cast in the opposition to Biden, and Biden won. They were virtually silent this time around, and Trump won. So maybe their being quiet has the opposite effect that everyone assumes it does. Pastors have an obligation to try and help form the consciences of their faithful. But look, it's a kind of bottom up clericalism to expect our priests and bishops to make the lives of Catholic citizens reflect Catholic values if we're not going to do it, right? I mean, I look around, people who know me hear me say this all the time. I look around the vineyard, and the parts that are sort of really falling into shambles tend to be the parts that are mostly the responsibility of the laity, right? Our economic life, our politics, our just sort of civic discourse, our family life, that's mostly the laity's responsibility. And our priests and bishops can't convince more than a fifth of us, or maybe a quarter of us, to go to mass on Sunday. The idea that they're going to speak firmly or clearly enough that they're going to tell all of us how to vote just seems unlikely. So I think the voting habits of Catholics depends in part upon the clarity and the courage of our pastors, but I think it depends a lot more on Catholic laity, who are the vast majority of Catholic voters, taking seriously their faith, making it an essential part of how they interact with the rest of society, and it not letting your faith be something that you do maybe for an hour on Sunday, but be the lens through which everything else you do is seen and makes sense and is understood. That's a tall order, but if you want to change Catholic engagement in political life, I think that's at the very least your goal towards which you're aiming.
Yeah, I would just say on that, I remember it was maybe 3 weeks before the election. At mass, I had this strange experience where I thought, oh, this is that thing that happens once every 4 years, or sometimes, in the midterm or whatever, if, there's a certain ballot initiative up or whatever, where we get the kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink political homily. Actually, in my experience in Tradland, that kind of thing is actually rarer. We're much more likely to have homilies about like how to make a good confession or why you should be saying your rosary. And I think I would guess that in kind of traditional Latin mass circles, you're slightly less likely, or maybe even vastly less likely, to hear like homilies on hot button kind of culture war issues, especially ones that are kind of topically inflected, than you would be at, a conservative parish where mass is being said in the new rite. But I am used to seeing this once every few years. And I can, in election years, basically. And I remember, thinking, but what is Father going to say here? Because every other time I've heard this, it's been far and away outstripping all the others in terms of significance, is abortion. And we have to think about that before we think of everything else. And I thought, well, Trump is effectively running a pro-choice campaign at this point. What is he about to say? And he said, the most important issue in this election is religious liberty, which bowled me over because I can't remember hearing Trump mention it even one time. I just don't. Maybe he made some passing comment about some court case that I don't know, but I don't remember the issue coming up. I don't remember it being mentioned by a single speaker, or at least any of the main speakers at the RNC. I don't remember any strong language about it in the platform. But I couldn't help but feel like that, in a way, was a really tangible shift where, like, I almost just felt like it would be better if you didn't say anything, because the fact that you are speaking with the same kind of would-be urgency, but the sort of horizon, the possibilities have receded. Like, I don't know, it's almost just like it's an acknowledgement of weakness or futility. Um, in the same way that, you talked about in 2020 when there was this very heated and very public thing about Biden, maybe because, he's a Catholic, where it seemed like the bishops, at least, even if there wasn't anything definitive, certainly there was an intervention of sorts there, and it clearly didn't matter. Um, and so I don't know. My instinct almost is not to speak prescriptively about things that are ultimately still prudential if it's going to be ineffectual. And maybe if you want to form people's consciences, you know, preach instead about why you should make, you know, the rosary a daily habit, why you should, you know, always be in a confessional, and all these other practical spiritual things. And, maybe having a well-formed conscience will follow from that. And we don't need like heavy-handed, like,
Yeah, good politics isn't necessarily going to make you holy, but being holier is about the best thing you can do for as a citizen. Um, I think that's a priority that everyone, clergy included, should keep in mind.
For sure. And I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you to the IHE for co-hosting this event with us. And thank you, of course, Stephen, for joining us. And